The First Crusade of 1095 stands as one of the most momentous and transformative events in medieval history, not only because of the religious fervor that inspired it, but also because of the sheer scale of the enterprise, the unexpected outcomes, and the enduring consequences for Europe and the Middle East. When Pope Urban II delivered his sermon at the Council of Clermont, urging Western Christians to take up arms in defense of Christendom and to aid their fellow believers in the East, the response was far larger than anyone anticipated. What began as a call for limited military assistance to the Byzantine Empire turned into a massive and diverse movement of knights, peasants, nobles, and clerics who would march thousands of miles across hostile terrain, fight in some of the most dramatic sieges of the medieval world, and eventually capture Jerusalem in 1099. The true size of the First Crusade was not merely measured in the number of warriors who participated, but in the political, cultural, and spiritual ripple effects that would last for centuries. To understand its magnitude requires examining not just the armies and battles, but also the motivations, the logistics, and the human stories that gave shape to this extraordinary expedition. The call to crusade came at a time of great change in Western Europe. The late 11th century saw a population increase, the growth of towns, and the strengthening of monarchies, but it was also a time of deep religious devotion and penitential culture. Pilgrimages to holy sites had long been a feature of Christian life, and Jerusalem, under Islamic control since the 7th century, remained the ultimate destination. Reports of persecution of pilgrims and the capture of Byzantine territories by the Seljuk Turks heightened the sense of urgency. Pope Urban's appeal promised not only the defense of fellow Christians, but also the remission of sins for those who took part, making the crusade both a military mission and a spiritual journey. The size of the response reveals how deeply the idea resonated across the social spectrum. Tens of thousands, from the great lords of France and Germany to humble peasants with little military training, took the cross and set out for the East. This was not a professional army raised by a state. It was a vast, decentralized, and multi-layered movement that combined faith, ambition, and desperation. The first wave of crusaders, often called the People's Crusade, illustrates both the spontaneity and the lack of organization that characterized much of the expedition. Led by charismatic preachers like Peter the Hermit, thousands of ordinary people, farmers, artisans, and even women and children, marched eastward with little preparation. They believed divine protection would guide them, but many fell victim to starvation, disease, or attacks along the way. Some groups, notably in the Rhineland, committed horrific massacres of Jewish communities, an early sign of how the fervor of crusading could be twisted into violence against other minorities. By the time they reached Byzantine territory, many of these groups were exhausted and undisciplined. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, who had expected trained knights, found himself overwhelmed by masses of poor and unmanageable pilgrims. Most of the People's Crusade was annihilated by Turkish forces in Anatolia, a sobering reminder that faith alone did not guarantee victory. Yet their sheer numbers, and their determination despite hardships, demonstrate the immense size of the movement at its very beginning. The real military power of the First Crusade came with the arrival of the princes, the great lords and knights who organized armies of more disciplined warriors. Leaders such as Raymond IV of Toulouse, Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, and Hugh of Vermandois each brought their own contingents, often accompanied by family members and household knights. Estimates vary, but scholars believe that perhaps 60,000 to 100,000 people in total participated, including noncombatants. This was an unprecedented mobilization, considering the logistical challenges of feeding and moving such a mass across Europe and Asia Minor. Unlike modern armies, these were not unified under a single command. Each prince had his own goals and rivalries, and coordination was difficult. Yet despite their differences, they pressed forward across thousands of miles, sustained by religious conviction and the hope of spiritual reward. The size of their commitment is evident in the sacrifices made. Families mortgaged lands, knights sold possessions, and entire households uprooted themselves to march toward the unknown. The journey across Anatolia tested the Crusaders' endurance and revealed the immense physical size of the expedition. After regrouping in Constantinople and swearing oaths of loyalty to Emperor Alexios, the Crusaders crossed into Asia Minor in 1097. They quickly demonstrated their power by besieging and capturing Nicaea, the former Seljuk capital. Unlike the People's Crusade, these armies were disciplined enough to conduct proper sieges and to hold their ground against Turkish counterattacks. The march through Anatolia, however, was grueling. Supplies were scarce, the climate harsh, and Turkish raiders constantly harassed them. The Battle of Dorylaeum in July 1097 showed both the vulnerability and the resilience of the Crusaders. At first ambushed and surrounded by Seljuk cavalry, they held their ground until reinforcements arrived, turning the tide. The scale of the battle, involving tens of thousands on both sides, underscores the military size of the crusade and its ability to overcome formidable opponents. After crossing Anatolia, the Crusaders moved into the Levant, where their presence began to reshape the political map of the region. The Siege of Antioch from 1097 to 1098 was one of the defining moments of the First Crusade, and it highlights the extraordinary scale of the expedition in terms of endurance and determination. Antioch was one of the great cities of the medieval world, strongly fortified and strategically vital. The Crusaders, numbering perhaps 30,000 by that point, surrounded the city but soon faced starvation and disease. Months dragged on, and morale faltered. Yet the size of the force and their desperation kept them from abandoning the mission. When the city finally fell in June 1098, partly through treachery by a guard within, the Crusaders found themselves immediately besieged in turn by a massive Muslim relief army. That they held out, rallying under visions and claims of divine intervention such as the discovery of the Holy Lance, shows the remarkable resilience of this vast and exhausted army. Antioch became the first major Crusader principality, illustrating how the size of the crusade translated not only into military victories but also into new political realities. The culmination of the First Crusade came with the march to Jerusalem in 1099. By this point, the numbers had dwindled due to attrition, but the determination remained immense. Around 12,000 to 15,000 Crusaders approached the Holy City, still a formidable force despite losses. The siege of Jerusalem was brutal and symbolic, with Crusaders constructing massive siege towers and scaling the walls under intense resistance. On July 15, 1099, the Crusaders stormed the city, leading to a massacre of its Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. The bloodshed shocked contemporaries but was celebrated by Crusaders as divine vengeance. The capture of Jerusalem, against all odds and after such a massive journey, revealed the true size of the Crusade's spiritual ambition. They had marched thousands of miles, defeated powerful enemies, and seized the most sacred city in Christendom. The consequences of the First Crusade demonstrate its scale beyond the battlefield. The establishment of Crusader states in Jerusalem, Antioch, Edessa, and Tripoli created a lasting Christian presence in the Levant and reshaped relations between East and West. For Western Europe, the Crusade opened new horizons, connecting cultures, trade routes, and ideas. For the Islamic world, the Crusade was both a shock and a rallying cry, setting the stage for centuries of conflict and coexistence. The size of the First Crusade lies not only in the numbers who participated but also in the profound shifts it triggered. It was the beginning of a two-century-long crusading movement that would dominate medieval politics, religion, and identity. Logistically, the Crusade was one of the largest endeavors of its time. Moving tens of thousands of people across thousands of miles without modern supply chains required ingenuity and sacrifice. Crusaders relied on local support, foraging, and sometimes plunder to sustain themselves. Many perished from hunger and disease rather than battle. The true size of the crusade is measured in the human cost, perhaps only a fraction of those who set out ever reached Jerusalem. Families were divided, lands left abandoned, and entire regions affected by the mobilization. Yet despite the losses, the crusade succeeded in its immediate goal, a testament to the scale of commitment that inspired ordinary people to endure unimaginable hardships. The First Crusade also revealed the size of medieval Europe's capacity for collective action. Though fractured into countless feudal states, Europe managed to mobilize a force that could challenge great powers of the East. This sense of unity under the banner of Christendom was unprecedented, even if rivalries and divisions persisted. The Crusade demonstrated how religion could mobilize populations on a scale that transcended borders, languages, and social classes. It set a precedent for later crusades, though none would achieve quite the same shocking success as the first. In the end, the true size of the First Crusade is not merely a matter of numbers or geography, but of its impact on the medieval imagination. Chroniclers described it as a miraculous achievement, a sign of God's favor. Pilgrims who became warriors returned home as heroes, their sins forgiven and their reputations transformed. The memory of Jerusalem's capture became a touchstone for later generations, inspiring both devotion and further conflict. For Muslims, the loss of Jerusalem was a wound that would eventually be avenged by leaders like Saladin, shaping Islamic memory for centuries. For Jews, the massacres associated with the Crusade marked one of the darkest chapters in medieval Europe. Thus, the First Crusade was immense in every sense, in the numbers who participated, in the distances traversed, in the battles fought, in the suffering endured, and in the legacies left behind. It was not a single army but a vast, messy, and diverse movement that changed the course of history. Its true size is measured not only in miles and men, but in the transformation of medieval society and the enduring memory of faith, violence, and the quest for the holy. It remains one of the most extraordinary episodes in history, a moment when belief, ambition, and desperation combined to reshape two continents and to launch an era of crusading that would echo through the centuries. 1. The historical context of 11th century Europe and the Byzantine Empire. The late 11th century was marked by political fragmentation in Europe, but also by growing populations, improved agriculture, and an expansionist spirit. The Byzantine Empire, once mighty, was weakened by internal strife and external threats, particularly from the Seljuk Turks who had inflicted a devastating defeat at Manzikert in 1071. This left much of Anatolia vulnerable. Western Europe, meanwhile, was experiencing a wave of religious reform and a growing warrior class seeking outlets for violence. This backdrop created the conditions for a movement that combined religious devotion with military adventure, ultimately resulting in the First Crusade of 1095. 2. Pope Urban II's call at Clermont in 1095. In November 1095, Pope Urban II delivered a speech at the Council of Clermont that electrified Europe. He called upon Christians to take up arms in defense of their Eastern brethren and to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim control. Urban framed the campaign as both a holy duty and an opportunity for salvation, promising remission of sins to those who joined. His words ignited an unprecedented response across social classes. This call was not merely a military summons but a spiritual revolution, transforming an armed expedition into a sacred pilgrimage, and it set in motion one of history's most extraordinary movements. 3. Religious motivations, pilgrimage, sin remission, and salvation. Religion was at the heart of the crusading ideal. For medieval Christians, pilgrimage to holy sites was a way to demonstrate piety and seek divine favor. The promise of indulgences, remission of sins, gave the crusade unparalleled spiritual allure. Crusading was framed as an act of penance, with participants earning eternal salvation through their sacrifice. Many believed that marching to Jerusalem was the ultimate pilgrimage, combining devotion with combat against perceived enemies of Christ. The belief that God willed their journey infused crusaders with extraordinary resilience. This spiritual dimension explains why people of all backgrounds, even with little to gain materially, joined. 4. Political and social motivations, land, wealth, and prestige. While religion dominated crusading rhetoric, political and social motivations were equally important. Many nobles saw the crusade as a chance to acquire land and prestige in the East. Younger sons without inheritance opportunities could carve out new realms, while ambitious leaders like Bohemond of Taranto envisioned independent lordships. For kings and princes, the crusade also offered prestige, strengthening ties with the church. On a social level, crusading provided an outlet for Europe's restless warrior class, redirecting violence outward. This blend of piety and ambition attracted a remarkably diverse array of participants, ensuring the First Crusade was far larger than envisioned. 5. The People's Crusade and Peter the Hermit's role. The People's Crusade, led by Peter the Hermit, demonstrated the extraordinary resonance of Pope Urban's call. Peter, a charismatic preacher, rallied tens of thousands of peasants, artisans, and minor knights who set out in 1096 without proper planning or supplies. Their zeal was unmatched, but their lack of discipline proved disastrous. Many perished during the journey through Europe, while others engaged in violent pogroms against Jewish communities in the Rhineland. By the time they reached Asia Minor, they were poorly equipped and easily massacred by Turkish forces. Despite its failure, the People's Crusade highlighted the sheer scale of popular enthusiasm. 6. Mass participation: nobles, knights, peasants, and clergy. The First Crusade's size was remarkable because it included not only knights and nobles but also peasants, women, children, and clergy. Entire communities uprooted themselves, driven by faith and hope. Chroniclers describe processions of pilgrims carrying crosses, chanting hymns, and believing divine protection would guide them. Unlike later crusades, the first was not limited to professional soldiers. Priests accompanied the armies to provide spiritual guidance, while non-combatants followed in search of salvation or opportunity. Estimates suggest between 60,000 and 100,000 people participated in some form. This vast mobilization, unprecedented in medieval Europe, underscores the First Crusade's extraordinary breadth and inclusivity. 7. Journey across Europe to Constantinople. The path to Constantinople was long and arduous. Crusading armies traveled through Hungary, the Balkans, and Byzantine territory, often clashing with locals or struggling for provisions. Different groups arrived in stages, creating logistical chaos for Emperor Alexios I, who had expected small, disciplined contingents rather than massive crowds. Constantinople became a gathering point where Crusaders and Byzantines negotiated uneasy alliances. For the Crusaders, reaching the Byzantine capital was the first major milestone, symbolizing the vast distance already covered. For Alexios, the arrival of so many foreigners presented both opportunity and danger. The sheer number of Crusaders overwhelmed his expectations and resources. 8. Byzantine Emperor Alexios I and his expectations. Alexios I Komnenos had requested military aid from the West, hoping for a small force of trained knights to help reclaim Anatolia. Instead, he was confronted with a vast and unruly host. The emperor was pragmatic. He secured oaths from Crusader leaders promising to return captured lands to Byzantine control. Yet trust was fragile. The size of the crusading armies alarmed him, as they posed as much of a threat to Byzantine stability as to the Turks. Alexios provided guides and supplies but sought to keep Crusaders under watch. This uneasy alliance would define interactions throughout the Crusade's journey eastward. 9. The challenges of logistics and supplying massive armies. Feeding and supplying tens of thousands of people across thousands of miles posed immense challenges. Medieval Europe had no centralized system for provisioning such armies. Crusaders relied on foraging, local markets, and often plunder to sustain themselves. Shortages led to starvation, disease, and desertion. The sheer size of the expedition often strained relations with local populations, who feared pillaging. Water shortages in Anatolia killed thousands, while harsh winters in Syria tested endurance. Despite these difficulties, the armies adapted through ingenuity, constructing siege engines, rationing supplies, and cooperating with Byzantines when necessary. Logistics proved as decisive as battles in determining the Crusade's outcomes. 10. The siege and capture of Nicaea 1097. The Crusaders' first major military operation was the Siege of Nicaea, the Seljuk capital, in May 1097. The city was well fortified, and the Crusaders encircled it while launching repeated assaults. Alexios provided naval support on Lake Ascania, cutting off supply routes. After weeks of fighting, the defenders secretly negotiated surrender with the Byzantines rather than the Crusaders, ensuring the city returned to imperial control. This angered many Crusader leaders but also demonstrated the power of their combined force. Nicaea's fall marked an early success and showed that the Crusade's sheer size, combined with Byzantine cooperation, could achieve significant victories. 11. The Battle of Dorylaeum and Turkish resistance. In July 1097, Crusaders marching through Anatolia faced a massive Seljuk ambush near Dorylaeum. Initially, Bohemon's vanguard was surrounded and in grave danger. However, the size of the Crusader army worked to their advantage. Reinforcements led by Godfrey, Raymond, and others arrived in time, turning the tide. The Turks, relying on horse archers, were unable to break the Crusaders' heavy infantry and knights once united. The battle was a hard-fought victory that boosted morale and demonstrated the resilience of the Crusader host. It also showed that despite fragmentation, the sheer numbers of Crusaders made them a formidable force. 12. The harsh march across Anatolia and attrition. After Dorylaeum, the Crusaders faced a grueling march across the arid plateau of Anatolia. Food was scarce, heat was brutal, and constant Turkish harassment slowed progress. Thousands perished from thirst, disease, or exhaustion. Horses died in droves, reducing cavalry strength. Yet the Crusaders' determination carried them forward, sustained by their religious faith. By the time they reached the fertile regions of Syria, their numbers had been greatly reduced. This attrition illustrates the human cost of moving such massive armies across inhospitable terrain. The march across Anatolia remains one of the most grueling and underappreciated chapters of the First Crusade. 13. The Long Siege of Antioch 1097–1098. The Siege of Antioch lasted from October 1097 to June 1098, one of the most grueling operations of the Crusade. Antioch's massive walls resisted repeated assaults, and Crusaders endured starvation, disease, and desertion. Cannibalism was reported in desperation. Morale nearly collapsed until a traitor opened a gate, allowing Crusaders to storm the city. Yet their victory was short-lived, as a massive Muslim relief army arrived and trapped them inside. Surrounded and weakened, the Crusaders rallied after the supposed discovery of the Holy Lance, inspiring a miraculous victory. The Siege of Antioch epitomized both the suffering and resilience of this immense movement. 14. The Muslim counter-siege and the role of the Holy Lance. After Antioch's capture, Kerboga of Mosul surrounded the Crusaders with a powerful army. Starving and demoralized, the Crusaders seemed doomed. At this critical moment, a visionary priest claimed to discover the Holy Lance, the spear that pierced Christ's side, buried beneath a church. Though its authenticity was doubtful, the relic galvanized morale. Inspired by divine favor, the Crusaders marched out and defeated Kerboga's forces in June 1098. This miraculous turnaround revealed the psychological power of faith within such a vast army. The victory ensured Antioch remained in Crusader hands, highlighting how belief could amplify the resilience of massive forces. 15. Internal rivalries among Crusader leaders Bohemond, Raymond, Godfrey, etc. The sheer size and diversity of the Crusader leadership created constant rivalries. Bohemond sought Antioch for himself, while Raymond of Toulouse insisted it should belong to Byzantium. Godfrey of Bouillon, a pious leader, clashed with others over priorities. These disputes often delayed progress and created divisions within the host. Yet despite disagreements, the Crusaders pressed onward, united by their ultimate goal of Jerusalem. The competition for power foreshadowed the establishment of separate Crusader states. The rivalries underscore that the First Crusade was not a monolithic force but a coalition of ambitious leaders whose cooperation was as fragile as it was necessary. 16. The Final March to Jerusalem 1099. By 1099, the Crusaders' numbers had dwindled to perhaps 12,000–15,000 combatants. Despite attrition, their determination to reach Jerusalem never faltered. They marched south along the Levantine coast, negotiating with or plundering cities along the way. Fatigue, hunger, and disease plagued them, but the sight of Jerusalem renewed their resolve. Chroniclers describe Crusaders weeping with joy upon seeing the holy city. This march, the culmination of years of struggle, demonstrated the extraordinary endurance of a movement that had crossed continents. The final approach to Jerusalem symbolized both the physical and spiritual scale of the First Crusade, a pilgrimage of immense proportions. 17. The Siege and Bloody Capture of Jerusalem. The Siege of Jerusalem began in June 1099, with Crusaders building massive siege towers and battering rams to assault its walls. Muslim defenders fought fiercely, but after weeks of combat, the Crusaders breached the defenses on July 15. What followed was a massacre of the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants, shocking even some contemporaries. Chroniclers describe streets running with blood, though the accounts may exaggerate. For Crusaders, however, this was the fulfillment of their holy mission. They had achieved what seemed impossible, capturing Christ's city. The bloody conquest epitomized both the zeal and the brutality of the First Crusade. 18. The establishment of Crusader states. Jerusalem, Antioch, Edessa, Tripoli. The Crusaders did not simply return home after Jerusalem's capture. Instead, they established a network of states in the Levant, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, and later the County of Tripoli. These states secured Latin Christian presence in the East for nearly 2 centuries. They required constant reinforcement, creating ongoing ties between Europe and the Holy Land. The establishment of these polities demonstrated that the Crusade was not only a religious pilgrimage but also a massive colonial project. The political reordering of the Levant illustrates the long-lasting size and influence of the Crusade. 19. The human cost: death, starvation, and violence. The First Crusade's triumphs came at staggering human cost. Tens of thousands perished from disease, starvation, exhaustion, or combat. Horses, vital for knights, died in droves, crippling mobility. Civilians often suffered most, with Jewish communities massacred in Europe, Muslim populations slaughtered in Jerusalem, and local villages ravaged for supplies. For many crusaders, the hardships were so extreme that they never reached Jerusalem. Chroniclers estimate only a fraction of those who set out survived the journey. The scale of death and suffering highlights the true size of the undertaking, reminding us that its victories were purchased through immense human sacrifice. 20. The true legacy and size of the First Crusade in medieval and modern memory. The First Crusade's legacy far outstripped its immediate achievements. For medieval Christians, it was proof of divine favor and a model for future crusades. For Muslims, it was a devastating shock that inspired later leaders like Saladin to reclaim Jerusalem. For Jews, it marked one of the darkest episodes of persecution in medieval Europe. Its sheer size was evident in the numbers mobilized, the distances traversed, and the political transformations it caused. Even today, the First Crusade looms large in memory as a defining clash of civilizations, embodying both the faith and the ferocity of the medieval world.